Hi everyone, thanks for joining our talk. We are going to be talking today about innovating the detective genre within narrative games. My name's Tim Scheinman, so I'm just going to go around the panel and ask them to introduce themselves. So Mark first, then Victor, then Lucas.
Hi, my name is Mark Brown. I run the YouTube channel Game Makers Toolkit.
Hi, I'm Victor. I'm a student at the Danish Film School, and I'm making a game called Mind Diver.
Hello, I'm Lucas Pope, and I made Return of the Obra Dinn, which is why I'm here.
I also make narrative detective games, mostly about the lives of musicians. I made a game called Family, and I'm currently working on one called Riley and Rochelle. So what we're going to be sort of talking about today is not in many ways really so much about, it's not a toolkit for how to build deduction mechanics into it, or not necessarily, but it's more about kind of the design philosophies of the people in this talk, which all have some striking similarities. In many ways, what makes a kind of detective game or a deductive game is somewhat up for grabs at the moment, and that's really because there just aren't that many of them. There's lots of games that concern police and that concern detectives, but as we're going to sort of see, these don't necessarily have a great deal of deduction in them. But in order to give some sort of framework for this, I thought I'd just talk about some of the similarities between my games, Lucas's games, Victor's games, and also some of the points that Mark has raised in his work on detective games over 3 or 4 videos. So the first thing I'd say about these is they're not always games about professional detectives, and they don't really replicate the kind of step-by-step framework of investigations in that sort of overt sense that you get in TV shows and then in games which want to replicate the detective experience. They are principally concerned with piecing together an account, but you're not involved in that kind of sequence of evidence gathering and witness questioning. And they don't explicitly present what evidence is important. Rather, it's for you to kind of decide what's important. So we're thinking about, her story, looking through the videos, deciding what you need to find. Obra Dinn, it's very much up to you. And so this leads to an unusually large puzzle space for the player where it's not clearly delineated what's relevant and what's not relevant. And at the far end of this, you've got kind of almost like interactive detective fiction like Neurocracy and stuff like that. And maybe Telling Lies fits into that kind of category as well, which is very open. They're also really agnostic to process. Now, this is very unusual for games which are very much really about process and leading the player through process, particularly narrative games. These games don't really ask for that. They just ask for the outcome, and how you get there is up to you. And in this sense, I think they actually share a lot in common with the kind of design-based problem-solving games of people like Zach Barth. And finally, the last thing is they kind of employ broadly naturalistic logic processes, which is, not point and click, goat and poisons and doors. It's about using your kind of regular skills and making you feel like a detective through using those sorts of naturalistic deduction skills. So anyway, that's a kind of, hopefully some sort of fair thing, and the panel may want to comment on some of those and possibly eject. But let's go to Mark first. So, Mark, your video, What Makes a Good Detective Game, in many ways, I know definitely for me and Lucas, kind of lit the blue touch, for me and Victor, kind of lit the blue touch paper in terms of considering this genre. What were the main points that you were raising?
The main thing I was looking at in that video was kind of this idea of how the player communicates their thought process to the game. A lot of detective work takes place in your mind. It's things you're thinking about of what information is relevant, or how do two pieces of information, two clues relate, or what question should I ask to a witness or whatever. There's lots of stuff that's happening in your brain, and you have to communicate that to the game in some way. And some of the more kind of maybe obvious or easy ways of doing that, like having a multiple choice question, or having information sort of be added to a notebook that you can then play around with, kind of ends up taking a lot of agency away from the player, because it kind of does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And, the thing I say in the video is we play these games to hopefully feel like Sherlock Holmes, but you kind of end up feeling a bit more like Watson, where the game is doing the detective work and it's just sort of asking these questions every now and again to say, are you keeping up? Are you following along? And so what I wanted to look at in that video was unique mechanics that can allow the player to communicate to the game in a way that isn't quite so sort of rigid, and allows sort of puts the onus on the player to do all that deduction. So things like the search bar in her story, having a huge number of possible choices through sort of combinatorial explosion in Detective Grimoire and Obra Dinn, and stuff like that. So that was kind of what I was looking at in that video.
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting how you kind of delineated the character of the detective and the actual act of deduction. I think one thing which is really interesting is you kind of drew a line in the sand between you might be embodying a detective, but you're not necessarily acting like a detective. And we can certainly see this in things like The Witcher and also like detective vision in Batman and stuff. Is that something you were sort of thinking about?
Definitely. I think this is generally a thing in games, which is there are some games that kind of readily give you a fantasy of being a detective or a superhero, whatever. They kind of give it very easily, and lots of tools that kind of allow for that. And they also have a lot of like theming and trapping to make you feel like you're sort of Sherlock Holmes. But it can come across as quite shallow and hollow, especially to someone who sort of played a lot of those games. Whereas other games like Obra Dinn and Her Story are only going to give you that fantasy if you really put in the effort and you really like show some skill or some understanding of the space. And so that, like that.
I mean, it's interesting, and I'll pass this over to Lucas in a second, but it's kind of the idea that so many games, place an importance on mechanical mastery, but actually in a lot of puzzle games, they tend to abstract away a lot of the competence of your character by just making the task easier. Lucas, when you were designing Obra Dinn, what were your kind of considerations for how you were going to give the player enough to proceed, but not so much as it became facile or trivial?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way that Obra Dinn was structured during development, I had set up the problem of I need to kill 60 people. And I need the player to sort of work their way through killing those, figuring out who people are as the game progresses. And I wish I had like a good answer for how I put everything together brilliantly and it all worked out in the end, but I relied on a couple of things about that structure, about the fact that the more you solve, actually the easier it gets. And so I really like the idea that the game isn't telling you everything all the time. This is something I do in my games a lot, where I rely on a lot to happen in your head. And with Obra Dinn, I really relied on that a lot. I wanted the player to sort of imagine a lot of things and then only require them to nail down the one thing the game was asking them. And I guess, because it was so complicated, there were so many characters, and I had to kill them in so many different ways, and I had to progress the player through the ship as well. They weren't just figuring out, I didn't need to just give them lots of mysteries to solve, even though that was kind of the main thing. I also needed to drag them through the ship in a way that revealed new things each time that they could solve old puzzles with. So I built a lot of tools to help me with that, and I kind of relied on those core structures to help me through, to kind of as a crutch to say, like, even if I'm not doing this quite right, hopefully by the end the player can figure stuff out.
Victor, as a student of these types of games, as we all are, but someone who's making a game right now, what do you see as the kind of how to put this? All right, so I had a really good thought in my head and it just went, but so there's a symbiosis in Lucas's game between the story and the act of uncovering the story, and you can see that in Her Story. But do you see that those were the two that kind of broke open that idea of the solving being the story, the medium being the message, or do you think that there's a long line of stuff going back to the point and clicks? I mean, what's your sort of history of detective games?
I think those were, for me, the ones that really brought that thought open. I think when I started working on Minddive, I was also asking out about what people could point to in this genre as references. And there are here and there some games that pop up, and I think Mark also mentioned some of them in his video. But I think just what Her Story and Obra Dinn really does is put it centerpiece and right in front of the entire game. And I think they're two nice games to talk about also because they're kind of concerned with two different elements that are kind of the headlines. I think in these games, it's the exploration or investigation, and then there's the deduction or giving answers. And Her Story is very much the first part. You're just mapping out the space, which is like one of the most compelling things about these games is like, oh, you take a bunch of information and then you boil it down, you find the patterns, and then Obra Dinn had that thing of having like this powerful validation mechanic where you can where the game asks you to show that you know what's going on.
Yeah, and validation mechanics I think are really interesting thing. I have some very strong opinions on them. I think they're necessary, and I think that I kind of differ from Sam a little bit in this regard, in that he's got a slightly different view of it. But Mark, returning to you, I mean, perhaps you'd care to comment on that same question, but we can also build your follow-on question into it, which is, when you spoke about this 5 years ago, Obra Dinn was just in its demo stages. To what extent do you think some of the points that you raised have actually been addressed by games?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously Obra Dinn coming out in 2018, I think has been very influential, obviously on your games, Tim, and a few other developers as well. But I think we've seen more interesting detective-based stuff, and I think one of the things that both Her Story and Obra Dinn showed was that it wasn't about needing to look like a detective game. It didn't need to be about being Sherlock Holmes or True Detective. These two games, they're, kind of, Obra Dinn is fantastical. Her Story has this weird sort of technological side of it. They're, the word I kind of use to describe them is like they're kind of contrived in a way. Like they're not trying to be realistic depictions of things. They're like these weird systems that only exist to prop up this really exciting and enjoyable gameplay. And so we're seeing more and more detective games that realize they don't have to be capital D detective games. So things like Outer Wilds, which is like nothing to do with crime solving, that has that amazing feeling of exploring a space and finding information and putting it into and sort of deducing things. There was an interesting game came out called Lucifer Within Us, which is another detective game, but it's more about like putting together a timeline of events. That's another like good sort of validation mechanic, because it's so open-ended. Like unless you really understand how the things went, then it's just not really going to work. And then also, I think like an interesting one for me is Among Us, which is a multiplayer game, nothing like any detective game that we were talking about, that has that like amazing feeling of deducing things, and kind of takes one aspect of the detective genre, in this case the sort of courtroom drama part of it, and figuring out who is the killer, and just focuses on that in an amazing way. And so I think that's like another interesting example of detective games.
Yes, I mean, like detective games, I mean, I guess I wonder about that kind of there's a few things that I think that games have got bolder in, and one is to present a large amount of information to the player that some of it can only exist in their periphery and they need to sort through it a little bit more. And then another thing which I think, I think probably, Papers, Please, along with this War of Mine and things like that, was a big part of this, was this idea of really linking mechanics to narrative, and making them inseparable from each other, and also the idea of complicity, right? Because a lot of the games that we're talking about draw the player very, very close in through the process of deduction, right? That's a lot of their work is done through that kind of synthesizing. And I mean, does anyone sort of care to? It's a very open thing I'm saying. Does anyone sort of care to comment and throw in there?
Yeah, I'll put a few words on that. So it's kind of like your previous question or point about structure and story, how you kind of tell the player the story. And for me, with Papers, Please and with Obra Dinn, the mechanics and the story are kind of one and the same. And that's a lot of that is down to just production limitations. I can't do a story and a game kind of separately and match them together at the end. If I want to tell a story, it's got to happen through the thing that I'm spending most of my time on, which is the mechanics and the part that I think is going to be fun. And I think that was really the case with Papers, Please, but it also with Obra Dinn, when I think back to that game, I tell a lot of the story a lot of the story is not true or not really relevant. The things like the sentences you can make, the sentence construction was a thing that kind of kicked me off and got me really excited about that game when I realized that it was fun to just make sentences, period. And so once I got that in there, I realized I could make all these verbs and killers and victims and things like that, and just right there, I'm putting all these interesting, cool, and funny ideas into the player's head, which actually are not relevant. A lot of them are just wrong. The captain kills himself with a cannon or something like that. But they're funny, and it's enough to create this really open space where the player is working in, even though they're not the correct answer. It's like it really fires off their imagination, is my hope. It's how I felt about it, and it's kind of like my games are pretty tuned to how I feel about stuff.
Yeah,
So
and
I like,
if I can build on the first part of what you said, is also just that it's an activity. I like, instead of thinking of it as like a mechanic and a story, I like thinking of it as what is the activity the player is doing, and is it themed in a way where it is cohesive with the world and the mechanical action you're taking, right? And so you're a passport agent, or you're border patrol.
Yeah, and I think also there's a small element of subversion there, that the player, when they start my game, they don't think they're going to get much story, really. There's no layout at the beginning of everything that's going to be happening, or introduction of characters and things like that, which gives me the opportunity to make it feel like a very limited and dry game, but to drop in pieces of story and elements of characters and things like that as they play, that kind of pop out of what they're doing in ways that are a little bit surprising, because they maybe didn't expect that, or they hadn't had that so far in the game. And to me, that opens up a lot of opportunities to subvert what the player was, to make the game more interesting by subverting what they expected, or to throw in little twists and turns, or to validate things that they thought at the beginning. Suddenly, it's actually something useful to them now. Either information they earned or discovered, or mechanics they sort of worked out a particular way to do it, and then later on it becomes a very effective way to do it.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, obviously there are puzzle games, and which are more traditional puzzle games that build in narrative. You think about things like Bonfire Peaks, and then also, Unpacking obviously has a kind of, a fairly ambient but, implicit story in it and stuff. But I think these ones arguably go a little deeper, because the method by which you're solving is directly related to the information you're taking in for the story. So you're uncovering the story, and you're absorbing the story through osmosis, and then you're kind of expressing it through an act of analysis, so it's kind of like better than just having the story exposited to you. You're actually expressing it back in the form that you're taking it in, which as a former teacher, I would say is a good thing. But I think one other thing that really I think is quite obvious in looking at her story, Papers, Please, My Game, I can see it in Mind Diver as well, is the degree of player involvement that it asks for a good time. And this is probably explicit most in just how its validation mechanics don't budge. If you don't get those three, you ain't getting any further. It's not going to be cruel to you, but it's also not going to put a hint on the screen. So what I really wanted to talk to you about, Lucas, is what experience you desired for the player to have in that game, and with a particular focus on a term I think you've used before, which is shoe leather. So, and the idea of having to, go through memories rather than just being able to access them from the book, and denying the player a certain amount of kind of UX shortcuts and stuff like that. How did that kind of shoe leather tie in with what you wanted for the player, and what was your greater vision for, how they were going to have a good time in
I don't want to inconvenience the player, so there's a kind of fine balance between making it a pain in the ass and making it something they actually want to do, but a little bit tricky. I think for Obra Dinn, I was really tuned to a certain kind of person that sees basically a list with holes in it, or an empty list, and really wants to fill it in. It's kind of like an OCD compulsion that you just want to fill. It doesn't really matter what the game is. It just, when you see that list of it, and it's got these blank spaces in it, there's just, you got to fill it in. I kind of relied on that a lot, and that's how I sort of felt about it. If I saw that list, I really wanted to fill it in. And so I guess there are parts of the game that I'm kind of asking a little too much. Maybe I want them to walk around a little too much, but I still felt like the person who is going to enjoy this game is already going to be someone who will do that to fill in the list, at a very low level kind of desire. It's not they want to find out the story. It's not that they want to see the rest of the ship. I mean, they want all those things, but really what they want is just to get that UI element, to have ink on every single line. And I don't know if that is actually true, but that was my motivation for a lot of it. That I want to have the structure of a game here around it, where they're exploring a ship and they're moving around and they're doing the work to figure this out and they're reviewing old memories and things like that. But in the end, they have to be the kind of person that cares about that empty list in the book and wants to fill out the manifest.
I mean, let's just throw that out there. I mean, I often, I have a lot of testers for my games, and they're always asking for more UX. It'd be nice if I could have a slider. It's nice if I could do this. What if I could do that? Somebody even said, what if I could search the web in the game, But what do people think? Like, what's the right level of UX for a detective game? Should Sam have put a slider for video position in Telling Lies or something like that? Should Lucas have allowed people to go back through memories just by clicking on the book? What's your thoughts?
You talking to me?
Oh, to everyone.
Yeah. I think the minimum possible, the least amount of UX you can put in there is the best. The perfect UX is the best one, which is not always easy to find. I didn't have the fast travel where you could just click on things for other reasons that maybe weren't that great. But I spent a long time simplifying the book. I had features in there before that I took out, so keeping that book as simple as possible was a key goal of mine. And I can understand why Sam wouldn't want rewind and fast forward on his videos, just to keep it simple. And it's not, you have to recognize you're losing some important functionality the player wants, but the simplicity of the kind of presentation in that case is maybe more important. And there's also a little bit of, sorry.
No, go ahead.
There's also a little bit of, you kind of your previous point, you kind of want to not annoy the player, but establish sort of how you're going to be talking to them, how it's going to work in this case. And it's the kind of thing too where it only works for players who are committed to the game. If you go too far and you make it a little, you leave out the one feature they really need, then it's just annoying. But I think there is a point to, kind of like Mark was saying, like I built the world for Obra Dinn, so I can say this book is limited and only has these certain features in it. If it was some actual character that had some tool that people knew about, they would expect all this stuff in there. But because I could construct everything myself, it was more important to have it kind of consistent and clear and simple than almost anything else.
I mean, Mark, do you think... Oh, sorry, Victor, you were going to say something.
Yeah. I just... I think that there's surely a balance. I'm glad you said the last thing about there are some things that the players just need, and otherwise it ruins their experience. For my experience with playing Telling Lies was playing it for 5 minutes and then installing a mod that let me scrub through the files more quickly. And we had the same experience in Mind Diver. You have one of the activities you're doing to collect clues is that you're listening to memories. So I should maybe just explain that, what Mind Diver is, that it's this detective game inside a mind, and you're restoring memories. And so each memory has a hole in it. And it's kind of very interesting that you said that thing about filling out, Lucas, because after many iterations, we finally settled on filling out holes in the memories. And there's something just deeply satisfying about that, about picking up an object from somewhere else in the memory and then filling it out and getting more information through that. But one of the, so two things you do in the game is you study the scenes, you study these memories that are similar to Obra Dinn in that they're static scenes, and then you listen to it. And the audio files are a bit longer than in Obra Dinn, so we've had to put in a thing that lets you jump back and forth in the audio, because if you want to re-listen to a specific point in the audio, it just got very frustrating not having that functionality.
I mean, in some ways, this is actually also, there's a kind of second level conversation, Mark, right, about the contract of competency, right, which is, we're saying we want you to become competent at this game, and so we're going to give you just enough that we feel to do it. I mean, what's your feeling on that? Because this kind of comes back to your original point, which is I want to feel like a detective. And if you kind of give the player too much, kind of hand-holding, they're not going to feel like a detective anymore, even if they can solve really cool deductive puzzles. I mean, what's your thought on, the ideal player experience?
Yeah, I mean, so I played this game called Call of the Sea. It's kind of like a sort of walking sim type thing with a few puzzles. And I was like, this is cool. And then I saw a symbol in the game, and the main character said, that's an interesting symbol. Let me write it down in my in-game notebook. And at that exact moment, I could just turn off a big chunk of my brain because I knew that everything that was going to be important in the game was going to be put into this notebook. And so it, just removed a huge level of like engagement where I just didn't need to observe the environment as much because the character was going to do these things. So like there's a certain level of, you need to give the player a certain level of help, and otherwise the game is just completely obtuse. But I mean, like an interesting thing I do think about is like games that require you to have basically a notebook by you when you're playing. That's like my favorite types of games. But that's, for a lot of people, that is a step too far, and they're just like, what I need, that's too much burden placed on me. And also I'm wondering, for you guys as the developers, like, how do you see that? And how do you kind of prep the player that they're going to actually need to like take some notes and think about this stuff, and they can't rely on it like a lot of games where they can just rely on the game telling them what they need to know? Like, how do you prep the player to know that they're going to do a bit of the heavy lifting themselves?
We've recently had a discussion about the UI, and should we have short descriptions of the memories in a book, and we decided against it for specifically the reason of, then you're taking away that interpretive element of, I have to be the one describing this to myself in my head or in a notebook. And it's like almost a design goal for us that you should have a notebook in front of you, right? You should be encouraged.
Yeah, it's a good point, though, that for a lot of players, that's a bridge way too far to expect them to do anything outside the game. But for me, anyways, I try to set up from the very beginning that it's that kind of game. So hopefully I'm targeting the people who will not respond that, the people who will say, like you, Mark, I love having a notebook here. I love kind of working in my mind with the game, not just having the game just input only into me. And so I try to, my games are a little bit janky. Obra Dinn looks weird as hell. It's already kind of not going to act like a mainstream game that would hand you everything. And so I'm already kind of trying to find the right player that it will enjoy what I've got to give them. And hopefully that works. And,
I mean, I have actually a little bit more sympathy with like the casual player. And it's funny because I've made some games where people literally dropped out the bottom of them because of bad design, like Conspiracy. But with Riley and Rochelle, I don't think I'd ever use a notepad playing a game, and I would want to rely on my memory. And although, I mean, Victor, you've posted up some of your notes from testing for Riley and Rochelle. It's fab, and some people do, sometimes in crayon, it's always interesting. But like, I try and limit the amount of information in a particular space to they don't need to. And I think that there's actually a really important thing in detective games, which is the amount of information becomes its own difficulty factor. If you're putting a lot of information out there, depending on how obscured that is through language, through artifice, through design style, that can act as its own difficulty modifier. And so my games are much more limited visually than yours. They're all based in language. So all the puzzles are language based, which means that I can act on two things. I can do a very careful process of training the player to look for various qualities in the language in a much more simple way than you guys, rather than having to train for them just to look at the whole space. And secondly, I can actually grade my puzzles a lot more easily. And so I have this whole spreadsheet where I've graded the puzzles by difficulty based upon obscurity and having to look back and things like that. And I try and go for a very gentle curve and keep it quite simple at the end. But, I think that's it's a question of scale as well. And my games are generally smaller than yours in lots of things. So I think this is actually a really good point to actually ask Victor a question, which I prepared, if that's okay, which is, Victor, we've talked about giving the player enough information to proceed, but what about giving the player too much information? And this goes for Lucas as well. Obviously, the hardest space to control is a visual 3D space, because you can't tell the player what to look at very easily without making it trivial. So how do you construct your puzzle spaces to draw the player's eye to the relevant stuff and not let them get caught up with a whole load of stuff and end up dropping out of the game?
Yeah, and another challenge there is avoiding the issue that many older point-and-click games have of pixel hunting, and that's not really the interesting part of the challenge, right? So you don't want that to be the thing you're doing all the time, just trying to spot the important thing. And in our game, there's an additional challenge, which is we're making everything through photogrammetry. So it uses this like lo-fi photogrammetry style where we're scanning real locations and putting them in the game and scanning real actors. And it comes with that it looks real, but it's not quite real. And it has this feel of a memory that is imperfect, but that also has a gameplay design challenge in it, that then some things are just not legible. Like you can't see very small details.
There's an ambiguity in there, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah. So the way we work with it is very much we scan a scene, but then we take out things until there is just enough that you can find the important things without looking for them a lot, and then there's enough to paint the picture of a room or whatever location it's in. But there's not so much that you come in and then you want to take a nap because you're tired. But it's very much by feel, adjusting the amount.
And Lucas, how did you control your 3D environments?
Well, originally you were going to be able to walk around the whole ship for every flashback, but I basically just created a zone where you're locked into that zone. So that gave me a smaller geographical area to work with. And it wasn't that hard to focus the player's attention, I guess, in the scenes, because somebody's dying, all those scenes are getting killed, so you're going to kind of focus right there. And I could put interesting things on the outside as kind of a subversion of what you expect is all the information to be right where the guy is dying. But I will say the idea that there's too much information was a huge problem for Obra Dinn. It's one of the reasons why there's a book to help the player sort of understand the information that they're getting in a chronological way, using the metaphor they know, which is a book. And this is one of the things I relied on. I kind of wanted the player to go through the game feeling like they're seeing way too much, and there's no way they can solve any of this, and they don't know who anybody is, and this is total bullshit. But then they hear a name, and they connect it to a guy, and so that's one guy down. And then suddenly they make another connection, and that's two guys down. And then they get three guys down, and they get those marked in the book. And then suddenly the game is, 57 names instead of 60, and it's that much easier. And it kind of relied on it sort of snowballing in that way, where the player does feel overwhelmed, but they're able to chip away at this incredible, vast universe of information this fire hose that I'm spraying in their face of information. They're able to, kind of, these metaphors are getting all fucked up, but they're able to like chip away at it as they progress through the game in a very satisfying way, all the way to the end. From the beginning when they feel like they could never do it, all the way to the end when they get the satisfaction of getting everything right.
And you've talked to me personally, and you mentioned kind of in passing the idea of the winnowing list, which leaves you with a lot of Chinese top men at the end, in my case, to solve, and some people on a raft. I think just want to kind of turn this open to the group, really, which is there are different, along with the idea of constraining the physical space to give just enough information and just not too much information, there's also the possibility, the list that you draw on of possible solutions, right? And there are actually different kind of categories, to my mind, of lists. So with Lucas's, you have a very finite list in which you can see all the possible options, both of deaths, but also principally the crew members. With Sam's, you have more of an implicit list, but it's searchable. So you have to type alphanumeric stuff into a search bar. The words are obscured, but they are finite as well, although there's a lot of them. My approach with Riley and Rochelle is actually to use an entirely generic format, which is dates, which means that one data structure is essentially no different from the other, and they're all interchangeable, which has allowed me a lot of flexibility in grading my difficulty, because I find the nature of a winnowing list is that as it gets shorter, it allows the player to cheese it more, and so it's harder you have to grade against that. So it's like rolling a boulder up a hill. You have to grade against that. But what are people's thoughts? Like, what is the, in their mind, different and interesting, or the best ways for presenting the possibility list, the sailors, the solutions, that sort of thing?
Yeah,
what do people think?
Well, for Obra Dinn, anyways, it was the value of having that list to me was beyond just a way to enter solutions, kind of what I mentioned earlier. just being able to have those sentences that the player can construct that kind of gave you a sense and idea of what was going on this ship, even though it wasn't really the correct answer. That was story-wise and narrative-wise, that was way more valuable. Well, not more valuable, but that was extremely valuable alongside the idea that was also the way to validate or to verify that you knew what was going on. So I think as far as like grading the difficulty, I added this difficulty meter to certain characters. If they were very difficult, there was 3 triangles. If they were easy, it was 1 triangle. Kind of as a last minute thing when working on the game, as a way to direct the player to tell them this character is hard and this character is easy. Focus on these easy guys first, knowing that the players also relying on that winnowing list to make the game easier. So as far as my like difficulty control over how to make the game overall easier or harder, I didn't really have much except to add more clues. For example, for a certain character, if this character didn't appear in enough scenes, I would have to add him in some more scenes or mention his name in some dialogue or something like that to make it easier. It was already hard, so I didn't need to go that far. Didn't need to work on making it harder. So when it came down to, at the end, is this game too hard or is this game too easy? Okay, if it's too hard, let me add some clues in there. Otherwise, ship it. Hopefully this winnowing works out well enough for most people that it'll naturally get easier if it's too hard for them.
Yeah. I think I can't answer your question on what the best solution is, Tim, but our solution at least is that the list is the scene. And that's really because we just have a deep fascination with like the direct interaction and not having it abstracted into a book or list. So, but it's certainly also a very hard way to do it, because then every option, like in Obra Dinn, you have a list of all the ways of killing a person or all the people in the ship. And then if we, and you need a lot of different options, or you can just brute force the solution very quickly. So if we have a question of who is the person who's in this place, we need a lot of different people that we need to put in the scenes. And so there's like a production challenge suddenly in making that work. But
yeah, I mean, for you have to actually physically model it. I just write a word and it's done. And you have to actually, I mean, Mark, I have a separate question for you, but is this an area that you'd like to talk about a little bit? Because obviously this is stuff that you're very interested in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the general answer I'd say is, as long as you've got enough options where it doesn't become a brute force sort of easily, or it doesn't prompt you. So with Obra Dinn, you've got 60 crew members, however many ways they can die, multiply them together, that's way more than anyone's ever going to use to sort of brute force it. And then obviously with having to do 3 of them in a row, my personal favorite, I think, is probably still the search bar, just because of that magical moment of when you type something in, you press enter, and then something pops up and you go, oh my God, I've done it. And that is such an amazing feeling.
Yeah, and I use that in when I was doing Echo Beach. I used that you were hunting for musicians, and it even has a little joke because it only shows 5 results, and it's this little search machine at the bottom. It says only shows first 5 results, thanks Barlow Tech. So that was a little joke I put in, which Sam happily retweeted. So I mean, I think one thing which I'm totally fascinated with is you did this other video, Mark, which is enormously influential on my other game, Hairdos for Hamsters, which I'm making right now, which is the difference between puzzle solving and problem solving. And to give it a quick précis, the idea was that in some games you're finding the solution, in others you're kind of designing the solution. Well, detective games seem to feel somewhere in between the two. You're neither finding a solution in the way that you would in like, Snakebird or whatever, but it's also not SimCity. So, I mean, where do you think the player is between those two kind of poles? What sort of emotional and play space are they sort of occupying?
That's interesting, because I think in, all of the games we're talking about, other than her story, it doesn't have, like a specific answer, but there is like an answer. Like in Obra Dinn, there is a solution that Lucas has put in, but I guess there is a bit of wiggle room in there, because you don't sort of input the answer in the same way that you do in Snakebird, where there's like a set thing where, a lot of the answering the question in Obra Dinn and other detective games happens in your head. So there might be a certain level of interpreting, each person can slightly interpret the data in their own sort of way, but ultimately there is a single solution. So it does, there is a bit of a sort of middle ground there.
There's a flex. I mean, what I was kind of thinking is like, if you think about the dominant puzzle type of indie games right now, it's the Sokoban, right? That is the dominant, particularly the work of Alan Hazelden. The dominant thing is a game which is very much about the process of steps that you need to take in a particular order in order to achieve an outcome. But a detective game is entirely agnostic to those steps and only cares about the outcome. So it's the opposite of a Sokoban. So maybe just at this moment in time, games like Obra Dinn exist in strong contrast to dominant puzzle forms in indie, but maybe that won't always be the case depending on where things go. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, there's also an interesting sort of thing to look at, which is there was like a Sherlock Holmes game that came out where you kind of came up with who you thought was the killer, but it didn't necessarily tell you if you were right, because sometimes, that is how things go, where like what is actual truth and things. So maybe there is a possibility of exploring detective games where there isn't actually like an answer you come to. And obviously that's also in her story, where it's less about there being like a specific answer and more about just the mental gymnastics of what you go through to get there.
I was thinking during this thing, a thought occurred to me, which is most detective games pretend to be Raymond Carver, but they're actually Agatha Christie. And these games pretend to be Agatha Christie, but they're actually Raymond Carver. It looks like it's all very kind of put together, but there's this big sprawling mystery. But most games, it'll be the posturing of a big sprawling mystery, but actually it's just a series of very small modular puzzles that needs to be linked together. It's been super cool. This is actually, I've exhausted the list of questions that I've got through, but I'm sure you've all got questions that you want to ask each other, because, there's a lot of people with some interesting ideas here. So, is there anybody want to chime in with a question they desperately want to ask somebody else?
I guess it's interesting for me to hear what you think is like the underexplored areas within this genre. So now, if Tim is framing this is like, okay, we're breaking it open, or Obra Dinn broke it open. What's then broken open? Like what is there to explore?
Can I chip in with a few ideas? So I think there's a few things that I've been thinking about. Firstly, I think procedurals rather than purely authored would be super interesting. I think right now we're actually in the midst of a kind of investigation revolution happening in the real world. And I would say there's at least two areas that I think are super compelling and need to be made into games straight away, which is one, open source intelligence, the kind that Bellingcat is doing in war zones. So if you go onto Bellingcat, or the work they did with Navalny, so if you go onto Bellingcat, you're going to find better detective stuff than you're going to find in any game and most books. It's just the way it is. Their stuff is, when they working out who Skripal's poisoners were, that sort of thing, unbelievable. And then the second thing I think is, I think there should be a game, a really hardcore, harder than Zach Barth game about tracing NFT wallets. I think tracing a detective accountant game where you're, for the really hardcore, where you're writing programs, you're actually writing code to trace data. I think that's the far end of like the quantitative thing, and that's, away from the narrative stuff, and then there's everything in between. But I think that games should really, somebody should be sitting down, please God, not me, but like somebody else, Shalavier, whatever, Zalavir Nelson, whatever, working out a way to integrate these modern forces and investigation and putting them into games, because I just think it's ready built to go, so I would love to see that. There's pretty far away from narrative stuff, but yeah, that's what I'd like to see.
For me, I think an interesting one is like social media is a thing. There was, you stalk someone on Facebook is kind of like a detective game, because you get these little tiny snippets of their life, and then you see they're having dinner with someone, and you search for their name, and you can, not that I've ever stalked anyone on Facebook, but I imagine that would be an amazingly interesting detective game to sort of have, and it's like ready made for the narrative as well, just because that is, exactly what people are posting is stories from their life, but just like this, anytime you're like tracing information across the internet, which is already this web of evidence and clues and stuff is sort of ready-made.
But there's that Wikipedia game that came out
yeah.
recently.
Bureaucracy, yeah.
But that sounds like that, right?
Yeah, it's a bit like Hypnospace Outlaw too, which
That-
captured a bit of that searching around for things.
And also you see it in TV. I mean, one of my favourite, investigative things was actually an investigative spoof called American Vandal, and there's a large part of that where they're putting together people's cell phones, their videos from their cell phones and stuff like that. So that's super cool. And then you could also almost like turn that into a roguelike as well. There's lots of ways that you could take generic data. If you could find ways to make compelling stories, you could turn it into almost like a roguelike and stuff like that.
I think there's something interesting in that, and which I also think is maybe an underappreciated motivator in this genre is like voyeurism, and like the curiosity of seeing what happens behind closed doors, what secrets are people hiding. There's so much of like, especially telling lies even more than her story, and in your games, Tim, it's like you're looking through diaries, and in Minddiver you're looking inside memories, like personal memories, right? So there is something here about like in the detective genre of looking at also the cruelty of people and all the hidden things.
There's that coolness, isn't there? And that comes from the American detective tradition. I mean, like, there's so much you could do just for like that. Looking in from the outside and the internal and the external is so interesting in games, because and we can do that so much. So I mean, we're part of a narrative festival. So I think we should, towards the end of the talk, we need to turn our eye towards, the introduction of detective mechanics into narrative. And I have a quite a challenging question, which is, can you do it without having to build the whole game around it? Because all the games we're talking about right now have all their mechanics built around, to serve deduction and to provide a playground for deduction. But can it be done in a more modular form? Mark, you talk about like Life is Strange and stuff like that. Or does it need to be completely one and the same? What do you think?
Well, I'd just say in terms of like making video games is incredibly difficult. So being like, I'm just going to do a little bit of a detective game over here, and it's got to be as good as Obra Dinn sounds like a huge challenge to me. So my advice would always be to like just focus on doing one thing really well. But I'd love to hear what others say.
Yeah, of course. If you ask me, yeah, if you're going to make a game with detective mechanics, I'm talking about me. If I'm going to make a game with detective mechanics, it's going to be the whole game, basically. I think for me anyways, it's a production thing, but also a focus thing and a kind of, not a marketing thing, but just a way to encapsulate what the game is. I think for me is a lot more valuable that this is a detective game and you're doing a lot of detecting in this game is a lot more attractive to me than something where you're doing lots of different things and each one of them is kind of just a little piece of what the story or the character is using.
I mean, it's not to say that you can't have a hell of a lot of story, though. I mean, and it doesn't have to be ambiguous either. I mean, obviously, we're talking about, kind of shadowy stories. But, I mean, my game, Riley and Rochelle, has a ton of very clear story. And it really is a kind of a soap opera about a love affair between two musicians with a detective mechanic. And it all works together. But there's still a lot of story in there. It could be a visual novel. It could have worked as just a click-through multimedia thing. But instead, I hope that players are going to go deeper. So my feeling is that if you want to do detective mechanics, absolutely do it. You'll probably need to build them quite deep into your game. And it's quite left brain, right brain, working out all those puzzles to serve your story. But you can still tell a real story with real heart in it and people. I mean, Mark, you played my game Rivals, and that has quite a clear story, doesn't it? As well as, detective mechanics. I think I think it's really interesting. The one thing that it tends to fight with is the way that a lot of narrative games progress, which is having a very delineated, clear and small set of options, and it's going to be hard to train the player to deal with both that and deduction.
Well, it's just how you get the most detective kind of games where, as Mark goes over, like you're passing through the story and then here's a puzzle and they've already filled your notebook with kind of the bits of the solution anyways. So you just kind of type it out and then you move on to the next bits of story.
I think a thing you probably need for it to work well is also a believable natural theming for why you have to look through a lot of information, right? It can be like a job that you're a detective, or I was working on treasure hunts with my brother a long time ago, and like we made a list of all people who do like investigations, and I think like there's like even and there's very uncommon, you don't necessarily think of them as investigators, but like a tracker who's tracking through nature is very much like doing deduction. And there's this game called Nuts, in the game called Nuts, which actually I would put very close to these types of games, because you're doing investigation, you're trying to find out where these squirrels are hiding and what their tracks are, and you're placing cameras and trying to answer this question. And it's not an obvious like I'm a detective, but that is really in a way that the feeling it creates still.
Observation, analysis, synthesis. Like, I mean, I talked about my game, the one I want to make, called The Gentle Art of Poisoning, which is about a woman who's, Deathloop meets Midsummer Murders, and a woman's trying to poison 4 people in her village by the end of the day. And to do that, you need to do a lot of detective work to discover different poisons. And so there's some crafting in it, and there's some stuff like that. So there are lots of ways. I mean, Victor's right. There are lots of ways you can just ask the player to take more notice of their environment and their surroundings. You just have to give them a bit of space. And I think in what it really comes down to is faith in the player, doesn't it? Which is we're kind of in the midst of this like indie counterculture revolution. And one of the things that's going to be definitely like coming up a lot is, how we consider the competence of the player, because obviously there's like Ubisoft at the top and stuff and Red Dead, and stuff like that, who handhold all the way through. But we as indie developers don't need to do that. We can take a much more laissez-faire and hope that our audience will find us, right?
Yeah, hope so. I personally like the games where I have to do a little more work, and it's really disappointing when you're playing a game you think looks awesome, and then it fills your notebook with all the clues anyways. It's like it just removes that part of your brain from thinking about the game. And I know there are other players like me, so yeah, being an indie and not really needing to hit 50 million copies or whatever, I'm very happy to have an audience there for the kind of weird, real hyper focus on these games that require a little more work from the player.
I mean, I remember playing LA Noire when it came out and thinking, this game's going to be amazing when the tutorial ends. And then the tutorial never ended.
Never ended.
And it took many, many years until Her Story in Obra Dinn came out for that to finally be sort of paid off.
Yeah.
I think it's also maybe not a discussion limited to indie games. Like Elden Ring is the big hot topic of trusting the player and how much UX. I mean, it's almost the exact same discussion happening everywhere about Elden Ring that we're having here about how much space should the player have to think, and how much do we trust the player to just figure things out on their own.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is really down to messaging. If the player understands that going in, then it's totally fine. You get the players who want that anyways. And in a game like Red Dead, they know the players don't expect that going in, so you can't really put that sort of thing in there. You're kind of limited by your audience, by what you can do, and that communication happens all the whole time. It's not something that you can spring on them in the middle of the game or at the end. And so Elden Ring, people know that that's a game where you got to put in a lot of work to enjoy it, and so you get those kind of players.
And it's not purely down to the game. I mean, something I found is that testers, I have a horrible time testing, and Victor, you can relate to this because we've talked about this, but players have a terrible time testing our games, and then it goes to some journalists and they tell the player what to expect and give a little bit of a it's going to be okay. And that's faith. If Nicole Carpenter or someone like that, or Christian Donlan writes about it and says it's going to be okay, they're probably going to let it be okay for just a little bit longer, So I do actually find like expectation management for these sorts of games happens in the press as well as in the game, So it's a funny thing. Anyway, well, look, that was us. So I really hope you enjoyed the talk. Some of us will be kicking around, in the world, so feel free to contact us, and we may or may not get back. I certainly will. If you ever want to reach me, I'm just on Twitter and you can direct message me. Otherwise, thanks very much, and thanks again to Fellow Traveller for having us as part of the festival.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.